So moving on to the diencephalon now. The diencephalon surrounds the third ventricle and it's the link between the nervous and endocrine systems. And as you remember, the third ventricle is here in a midline. It's a midline structure within an axial brain picture. It's a midline structure, and the thalamus sits on either side of that third ventricle with the intrathalamic adhesion connecting the two sides. And we took a look at this in Netters in the last section. We took a look at this area of the caudate nucleus, the head of the caudate nucleus and the tail of the caudate nucleus, and the amygdaloid body at the end of that. And then just lateral to that is the lentiform nucleus, but deep to the lentiform nucleus is the thalamus, and the thalamus sits on either side of the third ventricle. Now orient yourself to this picture. You can see that there's a B line here that's inferior and an A line that's slightly superior. Well, this is the A side here, so this is slightly superior slice, and this is the B side, this is slightly inferior. So these two are not the same slice, and they're showing you just slightly different images of the brain, and you can see how the shape changes slightly in the lentiform nucleus, in the thalamus, and also in the trigone area and the occipital horn of the lateral ventricles. So these are nice images. They can give you a slightly different view, just like we do on axial slices of the brain. The anterior horn of the lateral ventricles, the septum pellucidum in between the two, separating the two, the head of the caudate nucleus, a little bit of the tail of the caudate nucleus here on the left side of the patient, the lentiform nucleus, including the putamen here on the lateral side, and the globus pallidus here on the medial side. And then separating the head of the caudate nucleus and the lentiform nucleus is that anterior limb of the internal capsule, and then separating the lentiform nucleus from the thalamus is the posterior limb of the internal capsule, and then this is a genu again. There are some nice diagrams in e-anatomy that lay those particular areas in the brain out in color, and this is an axial slice of the brain, so the anterior side of the patient, right side of the patient here. And you're able to see the caudate nucleus, the head of the caudate nucleus in orange, and the tail of the caudate nucleus back here in orange, just a little bit of it. The thalamus in purple sitting on either side of that third ventricle. Then the lentiform nucleus here in green, with the darker being the putamen and the lighter being the globus pallidus. And so that's a nice image within e-anatomy. And then also a view from the superior portion of the patient looking down into the brain gives you a nice 3D schematic of how these are laid out within the brain. And if you are starting to visualize this in 3D, this could be very helpful for you. Sometimes it's a little confusing when you first look at it. They don't have the lateral ventricle on this side, so they've taken that away so that you're able to see a little bit more deep to it, to see the caudate nucleus better. They also have taken away the thalamus here. So in blue is the lateral ventricle. This is the frontal horn, and then the body, the trigone area, the occipital horn, and then going anterior and forward is the temporal horn of the lateral ventricle. And then in orange is a caudate nucleus, and remember, it follows tightly to that same shape, that same C shape as the lateral ventricle. So the head of the caudate nucleus is here, and then the tail is down here in the trigone area, and it comes forward to the amygdaloid body, which you don't see because of the lentiform nucleus. And the lentiform nucleus is here in green, and then you have the thalamus in purple that would lie on either side of the third ventricle if they showed that, but they're not showing that here. But some more nice images in e-anatomy, and once again I encourage you to look through all the images because you might find ones that help you decipher the images and get a good feel for where the anatomy lies within the brain better than these two if these don't work for you. So now taking a look at the hypothalamus, and I want to take a look at this picture up on the right hand side first. It's a maximized picture, or a zoomed in picture, so that we're just seeing a very small region of the brain. You're seeing the corpus callosum here and just a little bit of it. You're not seeing the whole thing. And then the septum pellucidum here, so this would be the area of the frontal horns of the lateral ventricles. and the fornix here, and then this is the third ventricle, and you can see that intrathalamic adhesion, so the thalamus would sit on either side of that, and so now you can kind of orient yourself to where you are in the brain. This is the brain stem here, and this is the pituitary gland. So this area here, hypo meaning below, hypothalamus, below the thalamus, is like a relay station. It's likened to a relay station, and it has a whole bunch of nuclei in here to transfer the information between the nervous system and the endocrine system. So it's sort of a pathway in between those two, and it has a connection down to the pituitary gland through the infundibulum or pituitary stalk. So this is a pituitary stalk here, the infundibulum, and the anterior portion of the pituitary is the adenohypophysis, and the posterior part is the neurohypophysis. And I know it does not show that in here, but we'll take a look at that a little bit later. So this is the adenohypophysis, and the way I remember this is that the adeno is anterior and the neuro is posterior. So adenohypophysis is anterior and neuro is posterior. And then we've got the optic chiasm here and mammillary bodies. And we're going to take a look at the mammillary bodies in a little bit more detail over in this picture here. So this is the area of the fornix. So this is this area here. And at the very end of the fornix are the mammillary bodies. And they sit down here at the bottom. They've got them in red in this picture here. And then at the very end of the at the other end of the fornix, and we don't see the caudate nucleus, and that's where you would see the amygdaloid bodies attached to the end of it. They don't have that in this drawing, but you can see the other end of the fornix as it curves around here becomes the hippocampus, and this is a region that we won't study in much detail here in this class, but you will if you go into Rate 401, the advanced sexual anatomy. This is an area of the brain where they take a look at the brain for seizures and that sort of thing. The hippocampus is also very important in memory. It's one area where we kind of hold on to memories and memories that stay embedded in the hippocampus. So in this image from Netter's, our regular midline sagittal image, we're able to see the whole brain again and put this into perspective. That magnified view in the previous slide, we can put that back into this picture so you can see a little more clearly where everything was. So this is the corpus callosum here, and then we talked about the fornix being just superior to the third ventricle. At the anterior portion of that is that anterior commissure, that's just anterior to the third ventricle. This is the third ventricle here with the intrathalamic adhesion, so the thalamus is going to sit on either side of that. Posterior to the third ventricle is that posterior commissure, as well as the pineal gland is posterior to the third ventricle, and then inferior to the pineal gland is a tectal plate. And then also here is the hypothalamus region, so just inferior to the thalamus is the hypothalamus. You've got the optic chiasm just superior to the pituitary gland and the sella turcica. Here's the sella turcica, which is that little saddle of bone that the pituitary gland sits in and is protected by. The infundibulum running down to the pituitary gland, the adenohypophysis and the neurohypophysis. And then just inferior to the hypothalamus, or just, posterior to the hypothalamus is the mammillary bodies. And they are anterior to the cerebral peduncles. So there you go, the mammillary bodies. Those are pretty easily seen on a midline sagittal view. We almost always see those. So the pineal gland is a midline structure, posterior to the third ventricle, and posterior to the posterior commissure right here. There's a posterior commissure of the pineal gland, and again we mentioned that superior to the tectal plate. We're going to see on the next images here some midline sagittal MRIs, and the posterior portion of the pituitary gland is normally bright on a T1 weighted image without contrast. The anterior portion is not, but the posterior portion is. So don't confuse that when you're starting to do MRI scans. It's always bright, even without the contrast. We're going to see that on the next slide. So here are two T1 weighted MRI scans, sagittal midline scans. The one on the left is without contrast and the one on the right is with contrast. Anterior side of the patient here, posterior, superior at the top. So you take a look at the pituitary gland, and without contrast, the posterior or neurohypophysis portion of the pituitary gland is normally bright, but the anterior portion is not. You can see the mammillary bodies, which we usually see on a midline slice. And then after you've given the patient contrast, the pituitary gland, the pituitary stalk, both enhance, as well as the venous sinuses, which we will talk about later in the unit, as well as the nasal passages and other areas within the brain do enhance. If you have a microadenoma or a little lesion on the pituitary gland, the normal pituitary gland will enhance faster than the lesion. So you have to be aware of that when you're scanning, and how quickly you inject the IV contrast and how quickly that will get to the brain. And just being aware of the scan time when you're scanning those lesions. And because the pituitary gland is well imaged in the sagittal and coronal planes, I wanted to show you this diagram and also this coronal T1 MRI scan so that you can see what the pituitary gland looks like in that plane. So here at the top, you've got the optic chiasm at the top and the infundibulum, and then the pituitary gland here sitting on top of the sella turcica with the cavernous sinus on either side. Same here, you've got the optic chiasm at the top, the infundibulum, pituitary gland, and the cavernous sinus on either side, and then this is the sphenoid sinus underneath. And this is a sphenoid sinus up here. So that just gives you another view. It's a view that we often do when we're scanning an MRI, both sagittal and coronal scans through the pituitary gland. And that takes us through the diencephalon.